The next major piece of news, and this is bad news, is that RaceDayQuads lost their lawsuit.
Yes.
And that means that any hope that we had that remote ID might not go into effect is now gone. It will go into effect, and we got to figure out what that means for us.
I think the only recourse is they would have to appeal to the Supreme Court. And I don't think there's preparation from anybody to want to do that based on the amount of money they spent and the amount of money it would cost and the realistic idea that it would go through, right? So,
yeah. I mean, the current Supreme Court seems to be pretty big on rolling back governmental. Like they just gutted the federal environmental EPA. They just gutted the EPA and said that if the law does not specifically mandate these exact things, then you can't do it. Do we want them to gut the FAA? I don't know. And like you said, Blunty, it would be a lot of money to bring that case.
I know Tyler's estimate for just the District Court of Appeals was $200K. I don't know what they ended up spending, but I know they only made like $83K on the GoFundMe. I don't know what they made from the donations and other things, but I imagine they spent quite a bit of money out of pocket for that, defense or for that appeal. So, I don't know that anybody's in the position to fund a Supreme Court fight.
Yeah, no. So this is where we're at. And the question, I guess, is, what does this mean for us right now, Blunty? That's where I want to sort of focus. Like, that's the news. We lost. Okay. You can read the decision. The decision is very disappointing. Almost feels like it was a foregone conclusion, to be honest with you. The decision reads basically like this. Lol, of course you need remote ID. These guys.
Yeah.
That's how the
way I read it was, there's no world in which this is enough to turn over the Constitution or to turn over like what you think is a constitutional violation, because that's a big precedent to set. Yeah. And it seems to me like nobody wanted to set a precedent there based on that information and based on the arguments that were had. We said before when we listened to the case, it sounded like the judges presented better arguments than the people that were arguing just because of the way that they drilled down the FAA guy. But obviously, when you think about how they're going to put that on paper and then have to deal with it later with precedent and down the line, I think probably opinions change a lot and things happen differently on paper than happen in the court. So.
Yeah. So here's where we're at, Blunty. We've got a quick summary. There are a couple links in the...
So I don't know how you want to show it. So basically, we got... maybe can we show this quick part like this, the write-up I did here? Maybe we could talk about it from this. Just the
That's a great idea. That's exactly what I want to do. Thank you.
Okay.
Blunty, thank you for writing this up, Blunty. Let me see if I can zoom in here.
So we tried to make it a little more user-friendly to kind of go through the main points, and then we've got a bunch more specific stuff we can talk about. But basically, the idea is, under remote ID here, basically, all current recreational and commercial drone rules will still apply. So everything you currently got to do, you still got to do, right? You still got to register, you still got to pass your trust, all that stuff. But it adds remote ID. So in about a month, on September 16th, the manufacturers will be required to install a remote ID system in any drone that is sold as a complete kit. The FAA doesn't have a perfect definition of complete kit. It's just a sort of a suggested definition because that's how they love to do things. But basically, the definition is something to the effect of has the motors, has the drivetrain, has basically all the pieces, and like has the ESCs, has the flight control device, and has the receiver. So from what we know, for any drone manufacturer, even from manufacturers who like make a bind and fly, right?
Yeah.
Who make these custom builds.
The Gepard-C, the Diatones of the world.
Yeah, for these to be legally sold here, they will need to either install a remote ID system and register with the government, with the FAA, to show that they are a standard manufacturer, or they will need to provide plug-and-play versions, which are essentially drones without a receiver or some part that's fundamental to the flight, which receiver seems the most obvious to all of us because it's the easiest to kind of plug in with the plug, right?
And let's be clear about this, that the requirements to be a remote ID approved manufacturer are substantial. There's record keeping requirement. And in addition to that, the remote ID system itself needs, like Captain Bry demonstrated a remote ID compliant system with his Express LRS hardware and Betaflight and a GPS unit. And the problem is that the remote ID system, for it to be an approved manufacturer, needs to be approved by the FAA. And it's not just going to be some open source thing you cobble together, because that would be easy to defeat. So the DJI, the Skydio, the Teal drones of the world, they are going to go to the FAA. They're going to pay their lawyers. They're going to jump through hoops and become officially approved manufacturers. And they will sell drones with remote ID built in. But hobbyists, the iFlights, the Diatones, the GepRCs of the world, forget about it. They're not going to jump through those hoops. And if they did jump through those hoops, the hardware, like, you can't put integrated remote ID into Betaflight, because Betaflight's open source and anyone could just hack it, and the FAA won't have that. Am I right there?
I'm not 100% sure that's the case, because I don't know how the ASTM standard reads. So one of the things they did announce just recently in the last week was they announced some of the standards that we can go by. And one of them is the ASTM standard. And that's basically a remote ID standard they developed. That's here. Basically, that's a remote ID standard they developed with guidelines for how you apply it. However, unfortunately, it's a $60 payment because it's like a standard from the ASTM Foundation or whatever, so they charge for their standards. But it does appear that it's sort of just a general, like, hey, you got to broadcast on Wi-Fi, and you got to follow these instructions, and you got to include these things. It doesn't seem, from what I've seen of it, it doesn't like necessarily automatically restrict open source. It doesn't necessarily automatically say.
I thought there were requirements in the remote ID law, in the rule, which that said that it basically had to be tamper-proof.
It can't be exactly. It can't be tamper-proof, but they talk about that in the version of, like, you can't, like, peel the, like, there needs to be a sticker showing that you didn't break into the device, sort of thing. Like that's the way I read that, right? So
maybe
it seems
you're suggesting maybe there's a loophole there, where it's like, it's tamper-proof, like the little adhesive that we peel off our receivers.
Correct.
That's quote-unquote tamper-proof. Perhaps.
Yes, that sort of thing seems to be the case anyway, of how they'll do it. So, but yes, it does not seem like most of the manufacturers will be doing that. They'll be instead providing drones that are not complete kits. They'll be plug and play or some style of that, to be legally compliant that you would buy. So for us, go ahead.
All that does is shift the onus from the manufacturer onto the person who assembles the drone, user. In other words, you.
Correct. The one thing that a lot of people are against, obviously, is import bans and restrictions on purchases, right? So, like, at least we have a way to purchase the things we were purchasing before in the same way or a very similar way. And then we get to decide how to follow the law or not follow the law as, like, a free citizen. I think that's sort of the way I look at that, right?
So I mean, that is good.
That's good, right?
The inability to buy a bind and fly hobby drone is annoying, but many people are going to swap their receivers anyway. So saying to basically, the first major step that this law may have on the United States is that you won't be able to buy a bind and fly. You'll have to buy a plug and play and install your own receiver, which is not the end of the world. Now that starts in 2023. The manufacturers have to comply in just about a month from now. And that's when we will stop seeing bind and flies sold into the USA, except from large companies like DJI, Skydio, Teal, and so forth.
And we say that's probably, but I don't know that we'll see, like, I don't know that the FAA has the power to immediately implement a ban. So, like, I don't know that we'll see, like, an import ban or, like, restrictions. So I think it will depend on, like, compliance of companies. Like, Banggood very well still may sell you a bind and fly. Like, I don't know that there's going to be any restriction to actually stop Banggood from selling you a bind and fly, right?
A company like iFlight that tries to toe the line is probably going to,
expect iFlight will follow suit,
Yeah. Okay, so then...
So like you said, users will need to be required to comply.
What will users have to do?
So in a year and a month, users will have to have remote ID. So that means if your drone is registered, so that means either your drone is over 250 grams or 249 grams, or you are 107 doing a 107 flight, right? So you're making money. Either of those, that drone needs to be registered, and that means you'll need remote ID. So there'll be 3 ways that you can comply with remote ID when that system comes out. You either buy a drone with it built in, okay, and that's going to add the benefit of, if you buy it with it built in, you're going to be allowed to do beyond visual line of sight within this law. You still can't do it if you're not allowed to otherwise, right? You'll still have to have your spotter and stuff. However, within this law, you're allowed BVLOS with remote ID built in, so that it's kind of part of it. However, if you buy a drone without remote ID and you add that drone in, or you add that remote ID module in, You can fly within the standard laws you do now, but you must stay in visual line of sight. And unfortunately, with what we'll discuss in just a second, that seems to include not having the goggles on. And there's kind of debate back and forth about that, whether that's going to apply or not. And then basically the third option, real quick, let's just say the third option is going to be if you don't do any remote ID, they legally only want you to fly at a FRIA, which is a FAA recognized identification area. It's like kind of a box they build. A group will register as a CBO, community-based organization, and then they'll be able to apply for FRIAs, which are locations will be able to fly without remote ID. That also requires a visual line of sight. So technically, you might not be able to do FPV there. So maybe we can look at that specific stuff.
Now, I want to call out two major problems with the way the law seems to be written. And then I want to put a great big caveat on those. And the two major problems with the way the law seems to be written are, number one, that there seems to be no way under the current writing of the law for a home-built, self-assembled quad to be flown with FPV legally. And there seems to be no way for a 107 to use a home-built quad, and especially with FPV. So it sure seems like this rules out FPV entirely. Now, I would like to point out that currently, FPV is not legal unless you have a spotter standing next to you at all times, and that the spotter always has eyes on the drone. And I don't think it would surprise many people to learn that many, many FPV pilots are not following that law. So many people are already flying illegally, and many of them will be like, oh, look, here's another law that I'm breaking. But I do want to point out, and we're not ready to cover this under the news yet, but I've talked to Dave Messina of the FPV Freedom Coalition, and I raised these issues with him. And I said, Dave, does remote ID basically mean you cannot fly FPV legally anymore unless you're flying a pre-built drone, like from a DJI or so forth? And he said that he understands that that is how the wording of the law seems to be, but that there are other conversations that he has had, and this is the part that we're not prepared to get into until he's ready to make a statement.
Well, we've got that statement.
He thinks it's not as bad. We've got the statements ready?
That first link is that statement, basically. It's like an organized statement by them that kind of goes through all the conversations they've had and where they think all the laws will apply.
And
from the FPV Freedom Coalition.
Oh, I didn't actually realize that was ready. Oh, that's good. Well, that's what I get for not preparing better. But I do want to say that this is, before we look at the statement, that reading of the law is a strict reading of what the law actually says. Certainly seems to say FPV is no longer legal now unless you're flying a DJI drone.
It specifically says manipulation of the sticks. So, and because it defines manipulation of the sticks and not visual line of sight, and visual line of sight is defined as manipulation of the sticks or spotter, then it becomes a situation where we assume that they're going to follow the letter of the law, and it says if you're not the person manipulating the sticks, you're in a violation. However, they said they basically they had a conversation both.
So let's look at that conversation.
Yes.
So this is, by the way, from Dave Messina of the FPV Freedom Coalition, fpvfc.org. Well worth a look. And let's see what he has to say.
Yeah, so they've got a summary. If you wanted a more detailed summary of what we discussed, they basically summarize, everything that they know about remote ID, how it will affect everyone, who's exempt, and how it will apply. It's just a more detailed thing of what we've gone over. But basically, as we scroll down here,
see if I can zoom this in. Hang on one second.
Yeah. So if you go,
there we go.
If you go all the way down to the section, the heading will be remote ID rule. That's where we want to go. Keep going there. Keep going.
There we go.
So that third point here, the third bullet point is what we're discussing. So sections 89, 115, A and B describe part 107 and 44809, which is the recreational, as individual manipulating controls of the UAF. In 107 and 44809, the commercial law, they say visual observer is when it's FPV is used. The reference is made to visual observer when we use FPV. So basically, they're saying, is that omission correct, or what is supposed to happen there? So they said the subject was discussed with the FAA on January 21st, 2021, and the FAA described their intent to continue to be supportive of recreational UAS flight, and in particular, how it advances STEM initiative. While the rule does not explicitly call out FPV operations are still permitted under the rec and commercial laws. We feel a request for an advisory circular from the FAA clarifying the use of FPV would be welcomed and likely request this of the FAA. So that's something I've been talking with Dave Messina about as well. They are going to request an advisory circular from the FAA, clearing this up for us so that we don't have to rely on somebody's word. One thing I want to mention real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I worked in cannabis for quite a while. And one of the things I did in cannabis was compliance to the law. And one thing you learn about government organizations is it doesn't matter what it says on the page. Right. It's very odd. You would expect that it matters directly what's said on the page and that's direct interpretation and you handle it letter of the law. But that is not how it functions on day to day. Cannabis, day in and day out, you are dealing with interpretation. It's constant interpretations. When you talk to an inspector, this inspector might have a different interpretation as another one. And it depends on the inspector that you get, on the day that you get them, and how they feel. And they are allowed to make their own decisions in these cases for these inspection systems. So I expect it's very similar in other government organizations. And when you talk to somebody and they say, we don't expect or intend to enforce it like that, right, it kind of does work like that. And in a lot of cases, they'll follow that if that same person is in place, right?
And here's why this is important. Because like Eric Toft in the Discord says, I'm basing my information on this video, watching Greg talk about the rules as written, and he links to a video from Pilot Institute. Then you've got guys like XJet, Bruce, and who look at the wording of the law and they say the sky is falling, and they're not wrong that the law as written has some pretty bad shit in it. But when you go and you talk to somebody like Dave Messina is involved in the ARC, the recommendations committees. He is talking to the people from the FAA, and he is asking them questions and giving them input. And when he comes back and he says, yes, this is what the law says, but I had a conversation with so-and-so, and he said that wasn't their intent. That carries weight. That carries weight. Because the FAA can just put out an advisory circular and go, no, FPV is fine, and that's it. Yep. So,
and I guess the message, that's part of what he's doing. Yeah, that's part of his goal. Yeah.
The message that I want to get across to people is that the wording of the law is as bad as people are saying it is, but those people are not talking to the actual movers and shakers behind the scenes. And they don't know what's going on behind the scenes. And it's bad that there's a law on the books that has bad shit in it. It would be better if the law did not exist. But since the law does exist, the next thing we have to do is we have to say, well, how is this going to actually be enforced? And when people like Dave Messina come back and they say, no, the FAA told me that they weren't going to do this. Something's wrong here. It behooves us to just take a breath and see how that plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it'll be interesting definitely to see how it plays out. We have people like Dave and the rest of the FPV Freedom Coalition fighting for us and making sure that they're staying on top of this stuff. We also have situations like, I just want to bring up, we had the BVLS ARC committee. So there's a committee that's literally just trying to get new rules for beyond visual line of sight operations. They're pushing for things like shielded operations, like we've discussed before. Basically, like if you're in your backyard flying under your tree line, why should you need remote ID? Things like that are being worked on currently. So there's always hope in that as well. And then constantly they're just constantly talking to people and trying to get stuff figured out. As far as where things are going to land, and try to get, like you said, the advisory circulars put out and things corrected more clearly so that we know where things are going to end up.
Now, okay. So, and by the way, I'm working on a video. I'm researching. I'm talking to people like Dave Messina and so forth, and hopefully we'll be able to get a video out summarizing this in a little more depth and letting people know what to expect. Today, though, who was it? June Loco said, just tell us the loopholes. Well, the loophole today is that the FAA has almost no resources to enforce this. So chances are that the average man on the street, and I don't want to be seen, dear FAA, I'm not encouraging anyone to break the rules, but chances are that the average man on the street will not know this exists, not care. They may look up and go, why can't I buy any bind and flies? Why is everybody selling plug and plays now? So weird. But the average man on the street or woman on the street will just ignore this and will not really run up against anything. And if anybody does hassle, you just say, oh yeah, I built this before September 6th. I would suggest that all of you start building quads today. Build like 50 or 100 quads before September 16th.
The sale is only a grandfather for sale, right? Not use.
Right.
Right.
If I build it before September 16th, it's exempt, right?
No.
But
because you're not selling it. That's my point.
Damn. All right.
It's only like if a manufacturer makes it and puts it up for sale before that date, they can sell whatever they want until that date, and then they can sell the old stock out. But yeah, for a person, you'll still have to comply. Well, the one thing I'll just say, like, we said before, but this was a task by Congress. So the FAA didn't decide to do remote ID. Congress was like, hey, we're worried about the skies and drones. We don't know much about it. Please fix it. Make remote ID. That's what they told the FAA to do. And that's why we have final rule. So, and that's why we have the NPRM, and that's why we have all that we have, the remote ID rules. So it's worth considering that a group who was tasked with doing this, and their whole goal was not to do this in the first place, and who doesn't typically like extra work because they're government employees, I don't expect to see hardcore enforcement right off the gate, gung-ho. Like, it doesn't make sense, right?
I mean, that's small consolation, but sure.
There's no driving factor for that. There's no, from what I've seen, there's no like finder's fee for law enforcement fining you for the FAA. Like, how many cops are going to be interested in weighing your drone?
I mean, the FAA is actively working on getting local police to help them do this.
The difference is local police helping. Do they pay them? Like, how many local police are going to give a shit to go out to the
ones
thing
who want to hassle someone who's flying their drone? This will be an excuse to hassle. There are two ways that this will play out in real life.
There was already an excuse to hassle, though. That's the way I look at it. Like, most of these places already have laws that you can't fly at the park. They could easily go hassle you in the same place, but they don't. I don't know. Maybe some places they do, but we'll see how enforcement works out. I don't know that there's any money set aside for education either, so I'm not sure how that will work.
Yeah. There we go. That's where we're at right now. We'll see how that plays out going forward. I think the people who mostly need to be concerned are people like me.
Yes.
Because if I am flying a self-assembled drone, if I'm doing a review, then it's a 107 operation. And if it is plausible that there is a spotter there off camera who is keeping my drone in view while I fly it, then nobody's going to bother me. But if the rule says I'm going to need to have a screen, because if you're looking at a screen, then you can still maintain visual line of sight. That's going to be the new plausible deniability, I suppose, is like, oh, I've got this screen that I use. No, I wasn't wearing the goggles while I was flying, Mr. FAA inspector. Yeah. That's where, until there's an advisory circular. And that's the one thing, the one other thing I wanted to say before we move on from this story, feels like it's about time to move on, is that someone in the chat said, yeah, but when push comes to shove, the letter of the law is what matters. And that's why we need an advisory circular, which is an official statement from the FAA about their interpretation of the rule. And that carries legal weight.
And they will be submitting and pushing for one ASAP. So
okay. Alrighty. Let's the spotters, licensed drive spotters must be co-located with the person operating the controls or the pilot in command. So you can't go BVLOS with enough spotters just using a radio system or something. They explicitly don't let you do that.